because she'd sailed to the United States in her own name. And obviously, obviously not MI5, but obviously the Scotland Yard had checked the shipping. It's the sort of thing you do check. Missing American woman. Let's have a look at the shipping lists. Well, her name was there. Everybody knew, at least the Liberal government knew, the DPP, who was a Liberal, knew, a man named Matthews. The DPP knew, the Liberal government knew, everybody knew except the judge and the prosecuting counsel, who was Travers Humphreys, who was the straightest prosecutor in England. He was so fair that there was no point having defence counsel. That was his reputation. That's why they chose him. Because everybody thought if they got Travers Humphreys prosecuting, there can't be anything wrong with the prosecution. The hell there wasn't. The second problem with the prosecution, apart from the fact that Mrs. Crippen was alive, is that the body they had bits of a body, remember, buried in the basement. Unfortunately for the prosecution, it was a bloke. Now this has been confirmed by DNA analysis. It is definitely a bloke. DNA test, it's a bloke, because some of the remains have survived. It is undoubtedly a chap. And as I explained in the book, there is a problem. Missing female bits from the prosecution's prize exhibit. Because if you're saying this is the body of a woman, you want some womanly bits on it. Won't go into detail, but you want your body to be a woman. Bernard Spilsbury, who was the very brilliant pathologist, very carefully said to the jury, I can't say if this is a man or a woman. Now, he must have known it was a woman. I mean, normally pathologists, good pathologists, are able to tell little details like this. Is it a woman or is it a man? There are clues, and anatomical clues. I didn't go to, the ladies present, but there are one or two. Normally, with a body, you get one or two anatomical clues as to whether it's a woman or a man. Bernard Spilsbury clearly knew that this was a crock. And Spilsbury protected his reputation by giving very careful evidence to the jury. Now, why would the Liberal government take the insane risk of prosecuting a man for killing his wife when his wife is still alive? The answer was that the chap he had knocked over was a rent boy who was servicing the Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith. Now, what had happened was this. Crippen was working for German intelligence, so was his alleged mistress, Ethel Leneve. Crippen was gay. Ethel Leneve wasn't his mistress. Ethel Leneve was his handler, reporting to German intelligence. Crippen was a safe house. His house was a safe house for rent boys who were servicing Asquith, who was the Liberal Prime Minister, who was being blackmailed over his sexuality by the German station in London. Now, this created problems because it looks as though the Jerrys didn't realise that Crippen was gay. That's my theory. I don't think they'd have put a rent boy with a gay in a... It's going to be messy. Anyway, they've got a young German rent boy who's servicing the Prime Minister. They stick him in with this married man who they think is heterosexual, who turns out to be gay. And, of course, Crippen fell for the rent boy. And it looks as though there was some argument. I mean, in the case, there are clues. For example, the rent boy's pyjamas, bottoms, are in Crippen's bedroom. And the rent boy was a bit younger and a bit smaller than Crippen, and clearly the pyjamas couldn't have fitted Crippen. They were the wrong size. But the prosecution just, wrong pyjamas, they just brushed over this. It looks as though there was some fight between Crippen and the rent boy. Now, Crippen had possession of a rate-date drug called scopolamine. Now, scopolamine was developed by German intelligence as an aid to interrogation. But the Jerrys found, and Crippen, remember, was a sort of homeopathic doctor, a sort of quack. He got on very well in the NHS. It's the sort of chap they had put in charge of general practice. Crippen knew that scopolamine had effectively acted as a date rape drug. It was the world's first date rape drug. And it looks as though, there's no doubt that Crippen had administered scopolamine, there's no doubt that the poor young man had scopolamine in him, but not enough to kill him. And what I've suggested is it looks as though Crippen gave the poor young man scopolamine, there was a row, and he fell down the stairs. I don't think Crippen actually murdered the rent boy. I think the rent boy died. I think it was manslaughter, not murder. Crippen then buries the body in the basement. The wife thinks, oh my God, we've got a rent boy dead in the basement. He's been shagging the Prime Minister. It's time to clear up. And I don't blame Mrs. Crippen for clearing off back home to the United States. It was a very wise move, which is one of the reasons why she survived and Crippen didn't. Crippen then flees, wholly unaware that the detective sent around to his house also worked on Jack the Ripper case and was working for the Germans. The detective had instructions not to search the basement because, you know, the last thing you want, if you're working with the Germans and you're going to the house of a German agent, the last thing you want to do if there's a body in the basement is go and search the basement. So the police did not search the house. Of course they didn't. Crippen, however, did not know this. He got into a panic. He and Ethel and Eve flee to Belgium. They go and see the German head of station in Brussels, who think, oh my God, shagging the Prime Minister, Red Boy, our whole control over the Liberal government. Remember, the Liberal government at this stage was trying to help Germany. The Liberal government was trying to hold back on naval expenditure, cancel dreadnoughts. They were going up to all sorts of nonsense. So the last thing the Jerrys wanted was this exposed. And they arrange for a ticket and they get Crippen out of the country. British intelligence spot what's going on. Crippen is arrested and brought back to face trial, but he couldn't ever tell the truth, which is why he hanged. So the Crippen case, truth about the Crippen case, revealed in Spyhunter for the first time. World War II. Asquith wasn't the only Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister, working for the Jerrys. In fact, as I say in the book, strictly speaking, all Liberal Prime Ministers have worked for the Germans with the exception of Palmerston and David Campbell Bannerman. Palmerston, of course, was a sensible Liberal. As I've said in the book, a rare thing. He had very sound views on gunboats, ladies and gentlemen. He always knew when to send a gunboat. Of course, I'm not entirely in favour of gunboat diplomacy. Sometimes it is not appropriate to send a gunboat, sometimes you need a frigate. Or a cruiser. But Palmerston's a very sensible chap. But apart from Palmerston and possibly David Campbell Bannerman, all Liberal Prime Ministers have worked for the Jerrys. And the Lloyd George, who was appointed, remember, by Asquith, who was working for the Germans, worked for the Germans throughout the whole of World War I. And I've revealed this in Spyhunter, and I've named 2 brilliant British intelligence officers who spotted him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we have the 1922 Committee. Because eventually British intelligence briefed in the Tory party in my old club, the Carlton Club, and that's why the Tories pulled out of the coalition in 1922, because they had verified that Lloyd George was a German spy. In my book I explained that one of the problems with intelligence is sitting on it. We didn't make a move against Lloyd George in World War I because too many people were uncertain about the intelligence. In fact, the analysis done by a brilliant Australian intelligence officer called Lord Casey, and a very brilliant British intelligence officer whose rover I ended up buying many years later. Wonderful man called Major General Sir Edward Spears, Winston Churchill's intelligence advisor in World War II. Spears and Casey had worked together. Spears had attended a number of high-level meetings. He was fluent in French and knew Petain, knew Lloyd George and knew Haig, and had translated for Lloyd George at critical conferences in Paris. Spears had had his suspicions about Lloyd George. They were verified after the 1916 Battle of the Somme. Now, Kitchener also had his concerns, and I suggested that is why Kitchener was assassinated. And I've named in the book the German spy who put an improvised explosive device on HMS Hampshire. She wasn't sunk by a mine, she was blown up, and I've named the German spy responsible. Now, it looks as though Kitchener had his doubts about Lloyd George. It looks as though that's why the Jerrys assassinated Kitchener. It was Casey and Spears who conclusively proved that the Germans had been given advance warning of the Somme. And they did that by a thorough engineering analysis of the German trenches. The Germans knew we were coming because Lloyd George had told them. And the Germans had therefore been able to harden and deepen their trenches, which is why the German troops survived the initial bombardment. Our calculations on the bombardment were actually correct. The problem was that Haig and the British General Staff did not know that the Germans knew we were coming and had therefore deepened and hardened the trenches. So our calculations are based on a correct analysis of the German trench network before the Germans had started to harden them. Now, I verified from the Turkish intelligence, my own contacts with Turkey, that Lloyd George was the man, and Ataturk knew this. Lloyd George is the man who betrayed the Dardanelles operation in order to embarrass Churchill. So Lloyd George betrays the Dardanelles and betrays the Somme, and was clearly working for the Jerrys. Remember all sorts of problems with ammunition and dud shells, and this was Lloyd George's responsibility. Lloyd George tried to stop reinforcements going to France in 1918 at a critical juncture. Right throughout World War I, Lloyd George was working against us whilst pretending to work for us. And of course, at the end of the war, he said, we'll squeeze Germany till the pipsqueak, which is outrageous. He pushed for a vindictive peace, precisely in order to deflect attention from him. The strategy that Eisenhower followed in 1945, deflected attention from his working for Germany by knocking off lots of German prisoners. Absolutely disgraceful. So Lloyd George is one of the top German spies revealed in Spyhunter. You get the see, ladies and gentlemen, you know, there are one or two ripples going around Whitehall with this book. Now, the next little episode, which is Between the Wars, covered in part 2 of the book, is close to your heart, and 2 little cricketing episodes. One is Bodyline. I've exposed Sir Pelham Warner as a German spy. In fact, he was spotted by British intelligence in 1917 by none other than John Buchan. Brilliant intelligence officer, wrote the 39 Steps. Warner was working in the Foreign Office for Buchan. Buchan spotted Warner in World War I. Jellicoe interrogated Warner in his quarters on the battlecruiser HMS New Zealand. He had special quarters built. He was going out to New Zealand, and Warner was invited in and gently interrogated by Jellicoe, who was a 33rd degree Freemason, extremely well placed and a very brilliant man. Now Warner came up with Bodyline in order, and Warner, at a match involving Middlesex, was one of the few in English cricket who'd seen it in action in 1910. The first time it was ever tried, Warner was the opposing captain. Worcester on the other side, and Warner stopped it. Now, Warner knew about Bodyline. Warner knew that Braddon had a tendency to back off to leg with fast bowling, which had been spotted in 1930 at Lord's. Warner's plan was to have one of the Australian batsmen killed, preferably Bradman, in order to drive a wedge between Britain and Australia, in order to make it easier for Japan to take Malaya and Singapore. In short, the whole thing was strategic. It was aimed at splitting off Australia from the British Empire, making Australia vulnerable to invasion, and making it more difficult for Australian troops to reinforce Malaya and Singapore. So it was quite a clever concept, but fortunately Warner was spotted. Somebody briefed in the Australians on the back channel, and the whole row was quietened down. But Bodyline had a very serious strategic background to it, which is all set out in the book. Entertainingly, in 1939, a German spy called Neville Chamberlain, of whom you may have heard, the notorious German spy Neville Chamberlain, was very worried about England's brilliant batting in the 4th innings of the 5th Test at Durban. That test match was called off, the timeless test. England had been sent over 600 to win, and we looked as though we were going to get them. There was a brilliant, brilliant double century from Bill Edridge. And what happened was that Downing Street put pressure on MCC, and the test was cancelled. Hammond pulled out. Hammond eventually got depressed. He was very upset about this. And after the war, he went to South Africa, and he was very upset about this. Hammond was put under pressure and abandoned the test match. The official version of events is the Union Castle line wouldn't wait, and that the SS Windsor Castle would